Now that we've covered the nature of hypnosis some, what can we expect to get from practicing energized hypnosis?
The ultimate goal of all my methods and all my work is to bring you to your actual real self. Let us look at it this way. Let us pretend for a moment there are three selves. Our idealized self, our real or actual self, and our diminished self. The diminished self is a result of comparing the idealized self with the actual self. And, except for one trick, which I'm not going to talk about today, the disparity coefficient between the idealized self and the actual self is gigantic. Energized hypnosis' goal is to not make you the idealized self, because that is impossible. The idealized self is not feasible. It's an infantile notion of glory and power and majesty, of greatness, that even the great actors and presidents of this country, for an example, cannot live up to. If you notice Clinton's affair, no matter how much power he had to have more. And what do I mean by that? He had to get away with more because of the demands of the idealized self. The idealized self says you're invulnerable. If you drink a quart a day, it's not going to kill you. If you have sex in the White House, no one's ever going to know about it. And you won't be impeached. If you jump off a building, gravity won't affect you. And no matter how absurd that sounds to you, this is the essence of the idealized self. The idealized self and the actual self. It's like looking into the Grand Canyon. The void is beyond comprehension, and it is overwhelming. What we are trying to do with the various techniques in Undoing Yourself, Energized Hypnosis, and my next book on meditation is to take away the power from the idealized self and return it to the actual self, hence decreasing the pain and misery caused by the diminished self. Diminished self is pitiful, and we all hate it. We can't stand it. But how come? Because we compare it to the idealized self. And no matter what we accomplish, this is why movie stars who have apparently everything are drunk, getting thrown in jail, taking drugs beyond belief. This is why they do it. Because no matter what they have, no matter what they have accomplished, it is never enough in comparison to the idealized self. This has been called by some people narcissism. And they always sneer when they use the word, but there is no reason to sneer, because healthy narcissism is totally essential. Otherwise, you couldn't survive. What we are talking about here is the narcissism that is not to your best interest. Now, where did the idealized self come from? The idealized self comes from a number of places. One, simply the fact that you're a human being. Two, looking up to adults and comparing yourself to them as a child, and you're always going to wind up being inferior. So here the idealized self creates fantasies of what they think the adults around them are and what they're capable of doing. And these are all fantasies. The child creates thousands of fantasies, thousands of false conclusions. Another origin of the idealized self is the identification with the adults and parents and the fantasies that the child itself has created. The child lives in a state of glory, and if it is helped by its parents to deal with actuality directly and factually and in a friendly fashion, the idealized self will not become the monster that it is today. Another part of the idealized self is the brutalizer. And the brutalizer is the one who spends all of its time, day in, day out, and at night, comparing you, the actual self, to the idealized self. If you watch your dreams carefully, you will find themes running through them. And most of these themes are all the same. You're compensating for your failures. But what is your failure? Your failure is to not have lived up to your idealized self. Of course there are real failures, but so what? We learn from them. But not with the idealized self. There is only one thing to learn, that you're worthless, pitiful, and incompetent. It's fascinating that people are so easily hurt by other people. But when you look at it clearly and calmly, what you find they're hurt by is that they haven't lived up to their idealized self, which consists of 1,000 ought-tos, 1,000 shoulds. I should be the best husband. I should be the best wife. I should be the best father. I should be the most intelligent at the party. I should be the most pretty. Someone with the idea I should be the most pretty, tell them that their makeup has run. There's a gigantic hurt. They're wounded. And the wound lasts for a long time. And this is very important to know. With a person who is in charge of themselves, they may still feel the wound, but it lasts for a very short period of time. Have you ever noticed yourself dwelling? And even when you stopped yourself from dwelling on an insult, a wound to your idealized self, that it'll pop back into your mind again in an hour, or maybe a week, or maybe in a dream, or maybe 3 years later? Now you understand the notion of revenge, why people feel they need to get even with others. 99% of the time, the only person you're getting even with is yourself, because you haven't lived up to a litany of shoulds that you do not even know exist. And if you knew existed, you would feel even more insulted. But your unconscious knows they exist. At one time I said, your unconscious is like an overflowing septic tank. Yes, overflowing. It is always there, and if you would, always conscious of the slightest insult, the slightest wound, the slightest hurt. You walk into the room and people are talking with each other and no one notices you. Wounded. Now, how does this relate to energized hypnosis, in case you forgot? Through reading the book and practicing the CDs and listening to them, you will begin to diminish the power and the discrepancy between your glorified, idealized self and your actual self, you'll find you'll have more energy and more power. Because most people spend almost all their time comparing themselves to other people, but that's a ruse. Who they're really comparing themselves to is this idealized self, this monster, and the brutalizer who is always ready to point its finger and say, you promised, you said you should, you ought to, and you didn't. So an honest man who is 99% honest finds one day that he did something dishonest. So what does he do? He brutalizes himself over and over and over again. And this does not have simply to do with honesty. It has to do with everything. You must be the best lover all the time. You must be the best thinker all the time. Now, there are people out there who take the exact opposite position. They actually prefer to be the worthless, used, misused, mistreated, misguided self, the worthless self, the diminished self, because they've compartmentalized the idealized self. So it is never threatened. It remains intact and invulnerable. Now, this was not the secret I was going to tell you. It's simply another secret. But when you think about it, you will find that when there is a large discrepancy, or even a minor discrepancy, between the idealized self and the actual self, you may find one of these 5 things occurring. You will either comply with an external force, an other, to reduce the wound to the idealized self and reduce the anxiety. You will either become depressed, you will become withdrawn, you will become hostile, or you'll become impulsive. Now, there are other factors as well, but these 5 are the most common, and I'll repeat them. You'll become compliant, you'll become depressed, you'll become withdrawn, you'll become hostile, or you'll become impulsive. Each of us has a style, and this is the other essence of energized hypnosis. It will help you find your style of dealing with anxiety. And usually we prefer 2 of the 5 I mentioned. Either we'll become compliant and depressed, withdrawn, hostile, or impulsive. You'll find people who are hostile, impulsive. You'll find people who are compliant and depressive. And you'll find people who are totally withdrawn. Now, the withdrawn person and the compliant person, they have sort of temporarily suspended the comparison between their idealized self and their actual self. Whereas the hostile person is letting you know this is exactly what has taken place, and so is the depressed person. One way of helping depressed people is to get them to be active, because what is it saying when you're depressed? You're inactive. You need to become active. But again, this is a problem. Some people are so confused and caught in double binds that if they have to do something to make themselves feel better, they feel insulted. In other words, that in and of itself is a blow to the idealized self, that I exist and that I have to do something to make myself feel better, that I have to do something that is feasible, to make myself feel better, rather than sitting around hoping, wishing, and fantasizing that magic is going to take place. Now, magic will take place. Don't be fooled by what I just said, that it won't. But it will only take place if you do it. And by doing, we mean repetition, which is offensive, remember, to the idealized self. Why do I have to do it over and over again? Can't I just have fantasies? Can't I just wish? Aren't I entitled to these things without doing them? These are the questions, both conscious and unconscious, and most often betrayed in attitude. That is nonverbal. The gait, the walk, the glance, the subtleties of the body of the idealized self.